Alright guys, let's continue on chapter 9, Wynn-Fall, the battle for Hilton. So I'll read the last paragraph just to refresh my memory. So Steve Wynn helped me in two ways. By pursuing a takeover, he put Barron on the defensive and kept him from focusing on his relicensing hearings. At the same time, the more Wynn's aggressive style offended Barron, the more likely it was that Barron would turn to me as a white knight. It's not a role I'm accustomed to, but Wynn played right into my hand. Wynn grew up in his father's bingo parlor, the son of a compulsive gambler. Later, he made the right friends in Las Vegas, managed to buy a small stake in the Golden Nugget Hotel, and eventually took over. His entire world has been Las Vegas and Atlantic City and gaming. He's got a great act. He's a smooth talker. He's perfectly manicured, and he's invariably dressed to kill in $2,000 suits and $200 silk shirts. The problem with Wynn is that he tries too hard to look perfect, and a lot of people are put off by him. Barron Hilton was one. Okay, so Barron Hilton, the guy who owns the Hilton Corporation, Paris Hilton, that family owns high-end hotels. But Steve Wynn, the guy who owns the Golden Nugget, he's trying to take over. Remember, Trump really wants Hilton to sell his property that they have in Atlantic City. But he has a battle of trying to get licensed for that Atlantic City hotel casino. But at the same time, his company is getting attacked. Some guy wants to buy him out. So that's where we're at, remember? It's hard to imagine two people with more different styles. Barron is a member of what I call the Lucky Sperm Club. He was born wealthy and bred to be an aristocrat. The Lucky Sperm Club. And he is one of those guys who never had to prove anything to anyone. He doesn't try to impress with his style or his clothing or anything else. If Steve Wynn tries too hard, it might be said that Barron Hilton doesn't try hard enough. It makes sense, right, guys? Why he would be that way. So move this. Holy fuck. Although Steve would probably never admit it, I'm convinced that he thought he was in a no-lose situation when he launched his takeover bid against Hilton. I believe Steve figured he'd end up buying Hilton's Atlantic City hotel, and quite possibly at a favorable price. Many people thought that the hotel was all Steve really wanted. There was even a certain logic to it. Under siege from all sides, Barron could kill two birds with one stone by dealing with Steve. He could say, look, I'll sell you my hotel if you'll agree to give up trying to get control of my company. But Steve Wynn underestimated how much he'd become anathema to Barron. Anathema? Like a pest? That's where I came in. One day after Wynn made his takeover bid, Barron Hilton became much more serious about negotiating with me. I like this part. He doesn't try to impress because he doesn't have to, right? He was born rich. He's already like, but Wynn, I guess, being a made man, he just likes to show that he made himself, so he likes to show it by, how he dresses, wears his money on his outfits. My first offer to Hilton was $250 million. As a big number as that is, I knew Barron wasn't going to sell for that price. He told me when we first met that he had $320 million invested in the facility. Selling out at any price was a horrible prospect for him, but reporting to shareholders that he'd taken a loss on the facility was out of the question. Within a couple of days, I raised my price to $320 million. There was no time to be cute and no room to be tough in this negotiation. Either I bid the price or I walked away. At the time, $320 million, even $250 million, represented by far the biggest gamble I'd ever taken in my life. Just a year earlier, I'd completed construction on the Boardwalk facility for less than $220 million. In that case, Holiday financed the entire deal and guaranteed me against operating losses. This time, the risk was entirely mine. As soon as I decided to bid $320 million, I called John Terrell, a good friend who was president of Manufacturers Hanover Trust. We'd already done a great deal of business together, and on this occasion we had an amazingly short conversation. John, I said, I'm calling because I have an opportunity to buy the incredible Hilton facility in Atlantic City for $320 million. I'd like you to lend me the money, and I'm going to need it within a week. John asked me a couple of questions, and after 2 minutes, he said, we have a deal. Just like that, it goes to show you the value of credibility. In return, I did something I'd never done before. I personally guaranteed the loan. It was a deal based almost entirely on my gut. I made my bid without ever walking through the hotel. Several of my people had taken a look, and I'd gotten to know a lot about the construction from contractors who'd worked on the facility. However, I felt it wouldn't be appropriate to show up myself in the middle of all the turmoil Hilton was going through. If I told my father the story, he would have said I'd lost my mind. I remember very well as a kid accompanying my father to inspect buildings he was considering buying in Brooklyn. We might have been talking about a $100,000 or $200,000 purchase price, but our inspections were anything but casual. We spent hours in the building, checking every refrigerator and sink, looking over the boiler and the roof and the lobby. So let me see. It was a deal based entirely off my gut. Talking about his dad. So how they did the inspections. Nor would my father have been alone in his horror. In past situations, opinion about deals I was considering had usually been split. In this case, nearly everyone I talked to opposed the deal. I was having enough trouble on the boardwalk with Holiday Inns, they pointed out. I had no management for this huge new facility scheduled to open in 2 months. I'd have to take on huge financial risks personally. I had only a verbal commitment from Manny Hanny, and it wasn't clear what conditions they might ultimately add when documents were drawn, or whether they'd have second thoughts about the whole deal. There was even considerable doubt that the market could support another major facility, particularly one that would have to carry a huge debt service at a time when interest rates were still quite high. Why, everyone said to me, would I even consider this deal? Why, everyone said to me, would I even consider this deal? So, and it wasn't clear what conditions they might ultimately add. Conditions, drawn. It was a lame. For one reason only, I believed that managed well, it had the potential to earn a ton of money. Once we agreed on a price, we still had 1,000 other small points to negotiate before we could sign a formal purchase and sale agreement. On April 14th, 1985, we sat down in Jerry Schrager's offices at 101 Park Avenue with the lawyers from both sides to get the deal done. Often, the easiest part of a deal is price. It's all the other points, in this case, guarantees about construction completion, responsibility for defects, size of deposit, allocation of expenses between contract and closing. That ended up creating problems and killing deals. Hilton from the very start was taking a fairly hard line. Basically, they wanted to sell the hotel as is so that when the contracts were signed, they could walk away from Atlantic City with no further obligations. Barron by this time was almost rabid in his hatred of New Jersey and particularly Atlantic City. The sooner he could put his nightmare behind him, the happier he'd be. This nightmare. The problem for me was that if I didn't win some guarantees about completion of construction, I risked getting killed later on. Say, for example, that it turned out there was a major defect in plumbing or the air conditioning system, and I was forced to rip it out. In a building this size, a major repair could easily run to many millions of dollars. So he didn't want to be responsible for what was already put together. Early on in the negotiations, we seemed to be winning on the deal points that we cared about. But then about midway through, the person in charge of Hilton's negotiations, Gregory Dillon, the executive vice president of the company, got a call from Baron Hilton, who was back in San Francisco. When Dillon returned to the table, the whole tenor of the negotiations suddenly changed. I can't say for certain, but it's my strong suspicion that Baron had decided he wanted out of the deal, in all likelihood because he'd gotten a last-minute offer for more money. It's even possible that the offer came from Steve Wynn in the Golden Nugget. In any case, Dillon and the Hilton lawyers suddenly began to raise questions about deal points that we'd agreed on. Deal points. I've been in a lot of negotiations, and I sensed immediately that they were trying to use these points as deal breakers. If we couldn't agree on completion guarantees For example, then they could walk away from the table without appearing to have welched on the deal merely because they'd been offered a better price. We reached something of an impasse. Greg Dillon made a suggestion. "We're not getting anywhere," he said, "so let's break this up and we'll come back tomorrow and continue." On the face of it, the suggestion made sense. It was early on Saturday morning. We'd been in the offices around the clock for nearly 48 hours, and everyone was totally exhausted and nearly incoherent. But my fear was that if we put off the negotiations for a full day, the deal would never get done. As a compromise, I suggested we take a break for several hours and get back together about 1 in the afternoon. The Hilton people agreed and we broke up. At that point, my lawyers made one more attempt to convince me to let the deal die, gracefully. In particular, Jerry Schrager was concerned about the financing. Even at that point, we didn't have a formal signed commitment letter from manufacturers Hanover. But to me, a verbal commitment from John Terrell was as good as a signed commitment. Jerry's point was that even if the commitment was firm, the guarantees I was being asked to make might make it hard for me to borrow money for other large deals. It was a very strange situation. As I sat in Jerry's office, I wasn't sure who was more eager to break up the deal, my lawyers or theirs. As it turned out, the Hilton team was more than 2 hours late in getting back, which only confirmed my suspicions. By the time they finally showed up around 3:30, I was convinced that the only way I'd get the deal done was to shame them into doing it. I stood up and began my pitch. How could they shake my hand and then not stand by the commitment? How could they negotiate for 3 days and then walk away? How could they force me to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on lawyers and not follow through? It was a disgrace, I said. It was immoral. It was wrong. It was dishonorable. My tone was more hurt than outraged or angry. I can be a screamer when I want to be, but in this case I felt screaming would only scare them off. Much of the deal had already been negotiated, and under the circumstances, unless I gave Hilton a good excuse, it would be hard psychologically for them to walk away. It's also possible, of course, that Hilton's hardline was all they pose, a way of trying to ensure that they close the deal with as few contingencies as possible. In the end, we reached a compromise. They would use their best efforts to ready the hotel for opening, and they'd agree to completion of a specific punch list of unfinished items, and they'd agreed to completion of a specific punch list of unfinished items. Also, they would allow me to hold back $5 million of the purchase price, subject to the facilities being delivered complete and in first-class condition as defined in specific terms in contract. I assumed the construction was sound. If it turned out that I was wrong and the defects I discovered ended up costing an additional $30 million, I believe Hilton would still be legally responsible. At 9 p.m. on April 27, 1985, we shook hands and signed a formal contract. I turned over a non-refundable $20 million deposit, and we set our closing for 60 days later. On May 1st, I made my first visit to the facility I just purchased for $320 million. As soon as I walked in, I sensed I'd made a good decision. Much work remained to be done, but it was a spectacular-looking building. Immediately, I began pushing all my people very hard. Over the next 6 weeks, we managed to accomplish what it had taken most other casinos as much as a year or more to do. We got our temporary certificate of occupancy. We finished the vast paperwork for our licensing. We hired 1,500 employees over and above those Hilton had hired. And we got the hotel and casino ready for opening. We also settled on the name Trump's Castle. My first choice had actually been Trump Palace, but then Caesar's Palace filed for an injunction on the grounds that it had exclusive rights to the name Palace. I decided it just wasn't worth the battle. We need to get marketing and advertising campaigns underway. And the last thing I wanted was to be forced to make a name change after we'd already spent millions promoting Trump Palace. Ironically, no sooner did I announce my intention to call the facility Trump's Castle Then Holiday Inns filed their own suit to prevent me from using the name Trump at all on a competitive casino. Within weeks, however, the suit was thrown out. It's common sense right there. Even before we opened Trump's Castle, I began discussions with several investment banking firms about floating a bond issue to replace my bank financing from manufacturer's handover. I began discussions with several investment banking firms about floating a bond issue to replace my banking financing from manufacturer's handover. A bond issue. I wanted to take myself off the hook personally, even if it meant paying a higher interest rate to do so. The major problem with floating a bond issue was that Trump's Castle had no performance record by which anyone could calculate how much debt it could reasonably handle. Also, the Trump organization had no track record running a casino, since we'd yet to manage one ourselves. In short, anyone who bought Trump's Castle bonds was making a leap of faith. They were betting that we'd make the facility highly successful from the start. That was the only way we would meet a debt service in the range of $40 million a year. To put that in context, there were several existing casinos in town that couldn't come close to supporting that kind of debt service. Somewhat to my surprise, several investment banking firms bid for the right to handle my offering. In return for a percentage of the total offering, they would guarantee to find buyers for the bonds at a specified price. Among the bidders was Drexel Burnham, who invented the concept of high-yield junk bond financing. But Bear Stearns, with whom I'd already done a lot of business, offered to raise $300 million, or nearly 95% of the total I needed. Alan Greenberg, the chairman, and Paul Hallenby, managing partner, were willing to bet big on me, and I liked that. To attract buyers for a speculative offering like this, one, you generally have to offer the inducement of a high yield. The bonds Bear Stearns prepared carried about the same yield as other casinos had offered on their own financings, but those casinos had track records and offered a far stronger guarantees to buyers. Bear Stearns did a fabulous job. I got a good deal, but so did the buyers. Anyone who bought the bonds is earning an exceptionally good return, and the bonds are now selling at a premium. The one thing I wanted to avoid above all was a repetition of the sort of problems we had from the beginning at the Boardwalk facility. Rather than hire an outside general manager, I decided to put my wife, Ivana, in charge. I'd studied Atlantic City long enough to be convinced that when it comes to running a casino, good management skills are as important as specific gaming experience. She proved me right. By closing the deal with Hilton on June 15, we were able to take advantage of the high summer season. The next day we opened without a hitch as Trump's Castle. People packed the casino and we did extraordinary business way beyond our expectations. On our first day, we earned gross gaming revenues of $728,000. For the slightly less than 6 months we were opening during 1985, we grossed just over $131 million. That was better than all but 3 of our competitors, and far better than the Boardwalk facility had done for the same period under Harris. The one difficulty that arose in the early months had to do with the clause in my contract with Hilton regarding delivery of the hotel in first-class condition. Under the contract, $5 million of my purchase price was held back pending completion of all work. As time went on, however, we discovered that there were numerous outstanding problems with the cooling tower, the sewage system, the computer system, and the fire alarm, among others. During the first 6 months we were open, my representatives and Hilton's quietly negotiated about exactly which defects Hilton was responsible for and which they were not. My people felt strongly that the items not satisfactorily completed ran to considerably more than $5 million. On the other hand, I was eager to resolve the matter amicably. I liked Baron Hilton. I felt sorry about his experience in Atlantic City, and for months I was the first to defend him in any conversation. As a result, when the argument over who owed money to whom seemed to be getting nowhere, I decided to call Baron myself in January. I got him on the phone and I said that since our disputes hadn't been resolved, perhaps we should sit down together and work out some reasonable settlement. Barron seemed delighted that I had called. He said that he would be in New York the following Monday or Tuesday, and that he would call me then to set a date. Instead, when I came into my office on Monday morning, I was served with a lawsuit from Hilton, seeking immediate payment of the $5 million the contract authorized us to hold back. I couldn't believe it. He's like fucking Hitler when Hitler was supposed to be Stalin's friend, and then he fucking raids him. The first thing I did was to call Barron again. I don't understand this, I said. I've just been served with a lawsuit, even though you told me we'd sit down and work this out together this week. Barron totally stonewalled me. I don't know anything about a suit, he said. He suggested that I call Greg Dillon, Hilton's executive vice president. Incredibly, Dillon took the same position, that he knew nothing about the suit. Not for 1 minute did I believe that both Barron and Hilton, his top deputy, would be ignorant of a major lawsuit filed by the company. I recognize that lawsuits are sometimes inevitable, and I accept that as a reality of business. But when a person tells me he's going to sit down with me, I expect him to honor that commitment. Remember, this is fucking Trump. The one people hate. One of the most hated men in the world. If we still can't resolve the situation, that's another story. From that day on, I stopped defending Barron Hilton to anyone. Hey. I also immediately ordered my attorneys to file a counterclaim. On April 2nd, 1986, we did precisely that, listing 94 separate deficiencies in the castle, along with our estimated cost of repair. The figure far exceeded the $5 million we've been authorized to hold back. Both suits are still pending, and I believe that will ultimately be upheld. But for that one sour note, the story of Trump's castle has been almost entirely a positive one. Much of the credit has to go to Ivana. No detail escapes her. She has systematically hired the best people in Atlantic City at all levels. From croupiers to hosts to her top executives, she oversaw the decoration of the hotel's public spaces, which are now quite spectacular. The facility is always spotless because she's meticulous even about that. And great management pays off. In 1986, we grossed $226 million, a record for first-year operations. My guy Caitlin clocked that, huh? Rookie. We are projecting revenues of $310 million and a gross operating profit well in excess of $70 million. It pays to trust your instincts. Great management pays off. It pays to trust your instincts. So that's the end of Trump Tower. No, Trump Castle. Wynn-Fall, the battle for Hilton. That was number 9. Peace.